Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Modern Recruiter podcast. I'm Shannon Castleman, Senior Manager of Global Talent Acquisition here at Greenhouse Software. Today, we're getting into something that has quietly become one of the biggest shifts in modern hiring: candidate fraud. And it goes beyond just resume embellishment. That's been happening, as we all know, for a very long time. Now it's more so deliberate identity manipulation inside of the hiring process, like synthetic identities, deepfaked interviews, and even organized rings of applicants that are targeting specific companies. Greenhouse research shows 91% of recruiters say they've already encountered some form of candidate deception in the hiring process. And on the financial side, companies are reporting an average loss of $28,000 per fraudulent hire when you factor in investigation, lost productivity, and remediation. And that's before you get to the security and the reputational consequences. So to unpack all of this with me, I have a guest who I think has one of the most interesting vantage points on this topic. Cory Jaffe is the Senior Director of Talent at Checkr. And for folks who don't know, Checkr is actually a background check technology partner of Greenhouse, which means Cory sits in this really unique seat. He runs talent at a company whose entire product is verifying who someone actually is. So he's both a TA leader, hiring his own teams, and he's working alongside the engineers and the product folks who build identity verification for a living. So Cory, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Very excited to be here. I'm the Senior Director of Talent at Checkr, based in Denver. Have 15 years of progressive experience building and transforming recruiting organizations across technology, hospitality, design, and manufacturing. But I'd say one of my keen areas of interest and focus is building data-driven, scalable, equitable hiring systems that align your talent strategy with business goals. Love leading high-growth teams to hire faster, hire smarter, more fairly, leading all engineering, go-to-market operations, and G&A recruiting. We currently operate out of 4 primary hiring hubs, so San Francisco, Denver, Santiago, Chile, and Nashville. And I will say one of our current pain points that's rapidly increasing is identifying and weeding out fraud in the process.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Cory. We're so excited to have you with us. Let's go ahead and kick things off. So there's a line in the candidate fraud report that Greenhouse just published that I think reiterates what I said at the start, which is recruiters have always managed, exaggeration, inflated titles, some overstated accomplishments. That's all kind of familiar territory. But what's emerging now is different. And so I'm curious, for you, is there a specific moment, whether it's a candidate or a pipeline or a Slack thread with your security team where the light bulb went on and you realize this isn't just resume inflation anymore?
Yeah. So like you said, those are sort of all the classics that we've all been dealing with over the years. I think for myself and even for the team, the moment it shifted is when we started to see candidates who are using other people's real profiles and identities. So not fake names, real names, like an engineer's real name, let's call them Steve, their actual LinkedIn profile, their professional history. And essentially somebody is out there harvesting these profiles of accomplished, oftentimes US-based engineers, and basically wearing them as a costume into our hiring process. One of the biggest tells, when you get on a video call, the person on the screen just didn't match their LinkedIn profile. So either no LinkedIn photo or just didn't match the actual profile photo. And it just didn't have the fluency you'd expect from someone in that background. We started to see then the actual person's LinkedIn post identify that they're not looking for any new job, that anyone using their profile applying to jobs is engaging in fraud. And I think from our perspective, that was just an entirely different category of a problem. It's so far beyond just typical inflation of titles or sort of fudging a little bit on the numbers when it comes to the dates you were at a company or titles. This was really much more organizationally driven. And whether we think this is through non-state actors or countries that are engaging at this at a really, really high level, it's something that just really changed the dynamic for us on how we need to think about candidate fraud and how we need to approach it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a new variation of identity theft.
Yeah.
And we've had some similar stories and experiences as well, unfortunately. I actually heard of another TA leader where they came across a candidate that had used like their entire own identity and profile and even like their home address, which is so scary. And I've even had my own team say that candidates have reached out like pretending to be them on LinkedIn and have certain messages too. So it's also like on the other spectrum of things as well versus just with applications. Um, so here's where I think your seat at Checkr is really fascinating, and I want to spend some time on it. A lot of people hear candidate fraud, and their
Mhm.
first reaction is, isn't that what background checks are for? But you know better than anyone that where the background check actually fits in the timeline and what it does and doesn't catch. So if you could just walk us through the gap, like where does fraud show up inside the recruiting pipeline before a background check would catch it? And on the flip side, where does the background check catch things that the recruiter never could?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that, like you said, a lot of the instinct that people have is that, isn't that what background checks are for? And I get that, but there's a gap that most people don't think about. A background check verifies somebody's history. It tells you what's associated with their social security number. It doesn't tell you like whether that person actually sitting in front of you interviewing on camera is actually the person whose name's on the application. So if somebody takes a real engineer's identity, submits the real social security number, the real employment history, that background check would essentially pass because the history is legitimate. It belongs to somebody else. That's exactly one of the main problems we've been starting to target with our identity verification or IDV product. So that you can run early in the pipeline or even just before the background check starts. It sort of operates off, essentially like determining the liveness detection of the individual, a biometric selfie to ID matching, and then also like forensic document analysis. So all of those things, the question it's just answering for you is this actually the person whose ID they are presenting? So if that fails, you don't even need to proceed in the recruiting process. You haven't wasted screening costs. You also haven't given a bad actor two or more rounds of access to your company's information. When we look at it, I think there's two distinct layers. So there's like the IDV that confirms who you are, but then the background check piece of things obviously confirms what you've done. To me, you need both of those, and they're trying to solve different problems. So one without the other can leave you with a bit of a gap and a bit of an exposure. Even just going beyond that, I think there's just beyond identity fraud, there's the other layer of fraud features that we're seeing across the funnel that we touched on. So proxy interviewers, generative AI, to provide answers, along with all your standard like credential fraud and resume fraud.
I'm curious, you mentioned ID verification at Checkr. Like, where do you all typically find that that fits best in the process as a complementary tool to the background check?
Yeah, I think it depends upon like the modality of the position itself, and then also, um, you know, if that role is going to be remote or if it's going to be on site. I think for companies that use a lot of remote hiring, and when we hire for remote roles, we like to have it earlier in the process, especially if there's any signals that we get from like potential resume fraud or profile fraud. That allows you again to sort of like have a better check early on in the process. For, the rest of our standard hiring process for like on site, we tend to keep it just before the background check. So as part of the background check itself.
Got it. Got it. I know. I think a lot of teams out there right now, they want, like a silver bullet, something that's just going to protect them from all the different types of candidate fraud that we mentioned. And it's one step of the process. But unfortunately, that's just not the solution that's going to work in this day and age.
Yeah.
Even with our own team, we call it like the Swiss cheese effect, where it's multiple layers of protection. And so if someone slips through one hole, you hope that like another layer catches it. So I know like even on our end, we have from like the very first step, there's like spam block lists of past people that have been reported as spam. We then have through our own tool, talent matching, like top of funnel metadata, which is like IP address, like different device signals, location to help flag risks early on. And then we do like interview recordings and transcription of the actual interviews. And then we
Mhm.
also do an identity verification and then the background check and employment history verification. And so it's like so many different steps you have to do to make sure that you have enough of a net to like catch those bad actors.
Yeah, no, and nowadays that's what you need. You need to be thoughtful about all the different technologies we have at our hands to try and guard against the technologies people are
Mhm.
using against us. and layer it strategically throughout the process.
Yeah. And something you brought up in your response was around like where you layer it in depends on the type of role, like where it is. You mentioned remote versus an office.
Mhm.
So I think let's talk about something that maybe didn't exist 6+ years ago in the same way, pre-COVID, and the way an increasing remote workforce sort of plays into all of this. So in 2025, Amazon disclosed that they blocked thousands of suspected North Korean job applications for remote technical roles. So, do you think that candidate fraud is a remote work problem? And if it is, what should hiring leaders be rethinking about how they run their remote interview processes specifically?
Yeah, honestly, I don't think entirely. It definitely is a big portion of it. But that being said, you're going to run into fraud, and candidate fraud, and bad actors across all role types, whether they be on site or remote. I do think the remote work removed that sort of like last safeguard that was quietly catching this, and that was, you know, in-person hiring, showing up, you're essentially handing over an ID on day one. Nobody designed that as a prevention step, but it has turned out to be that. So even if you removed in all remote work, I don't think that would really change the fact you still have a lot of these actors coming into the funnel in that way, trying to commit fraud. So, you know, to me now the whole hiring journey, so your application, your screen, your interviews, offer, background check, day one, that can happen without anyone ever physically confirming who you say you are. So for bad actors who are especially organized, that's a huge opening for them. So, how I think about it, everyone's required to show up in the office on day one. We've sort of recently made that pivot as a business. So and this is to counteract specifically against that. We don't want to be sending bad actors a company laptop that's been loaded with access to our entire code base. Making that person show up day one is a huge friction point. But we have to be honest, remote work is not going away and it shouldn't. But what we need to do is go about the assumption that we have certain verification practices that need to keep pace with how hiring actually works now in today's environment. So they haven't as much up to this point, but now you're seeing, just a huge influx of whether it be resume fraud, identity verification, and other products that are starting to take this on. And I think it's actually putting us in the right direction to start to guard against it, but also be a little bit more thoughtful and strategic in how we approach the hiring process ourselves.
I really like the solution you presented around having candidates show up on at least just the first day of work to confirm they are who they say they are. And don't get me wrong, the last thing I want to do is to have people walk away from this call being like, we should return to office. Like, remote work isn't good. It's going to increase our candidate fraud. I'm very personally grateful that Greenhouse Software is a remote first company. And I think there's a lot of benefits to it.
Right.
But that's a great idea. And I think some of my immediate anticipated pushback from, stakeholders would be, oh, well, the expense of like flying someone in person into the office. But then we just went over that stat earlier in the call, which is it's way more expensive for your candidate to accidentally hire a fraudulent candidate than it would be to fly someone in person for their first day of onboarding or training.
Exactly, exactly. And then you could even take the approach to like, what does that mean for like, their engagement starting off on the right foot, really strong
Yeah.
onboarding. So if you do have an opportunity to bring somebody out for day one, you do want to continue to sort of like put in, structures to block against potential fraud. Like you said, it's really the ROI in it is probably better in the long run.
Outside of the remote work aspect, are there any other like large themes that you're seeing as far as where candidate fraud tends to show up?
We're seeing it probably 5 to 10x in like engineering and technical hiring. So on sort of like the business and G&A side, we're just not really seeing much of it. And again, we're unsure where the source of the bulk of this is coming from. Is it just, individuals have become a lot more savvy with all the tools that are out there, or are they really like, state actors and much more organized crime groups who are committing this? And don't totally know the end point. Like, are they just looking to maybe get a few paychecks of money and then know that they're going to be caught and sort of exited from the business or exited from the systems? Or are they truly going after more like, proprietary IP information within businesses? So, yeah, we're really unsure, but we're definitely seeing it way more on the engineering, sort of technical hiring side of things versus like business recruiting.
Yeah, our team's experiencing the same. I pulled some of them briefly before this podcast just to get like the most recent state of things. And one of my technical recruiters said that for any role that has the word engineer in the job title that's fully
Mhm.
remote, she's typically experiencing 40 to 60% of the applications are candidate fraud. And I think
Yeah.
that's interesting because the Gartner stat that everyone talks about is, oh, by 2028, 25% of candidates. And I'm like, well, for engineer roles, it's actually already up to almost 60, which
Yeah.
is way more than we anticipated. And we initially only were really seeing it in the US, but we're even starting to see it in Canada, as well as even a little bit in EMEA. It's starting to rise a little more too. So this is becoming more than just a US only problem.
Yeah, and it's something that like it's evolving so quickly, and most of us weren't working this with those behaviors and mindsets to sort of like be more discerning throughout the process when it comes to examining resumes, cross-checking LinkedIn profiles, using all the tools we have at hand, along with like internal tooling when it comes to digital forensics. It's just something, yeah, we need to like retrain ourselves quickly.
Cory, I know a lot of what we talked about with candidate fraud are candidates not being who they say they are, actual like identity theft or manipulation. And I think what still rings true, which is like the old school version of candidate fraud that we experience, is more so like candidate embellishment. So maybe the candidate is who they say they are, but what's represented either on their resume or in the interview process, as far as companies they've worked for, titles they've held, or even accomplishments they've had is embellished, especially in the age of candidate AI, where everyone can kind of put a little filter or polish on their experience. What are your thoughts on how recruiters can best uncover the truth and sort of verify information and lived experiences from candidates?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you have to take a very systematic approach to your hiring process, so very structured when it comes to, essentially you're building a job description to try and like entice a candidate or go source a candidate and then match up their skills and experience to it. But like you said, you'll find some individuals who are going to do some embellishment because they know what you're looking for. So they have ability to pretty quickly through different tools like spin up, experiences that are close to that. What we like to do is really dig in deep and build structured rubrics when it comes to that candidate interview, and have it be, a very diversified interview across the process with each leader that's taking part of the interview panel, along with the hiring manager and the recruiter themselves, sort of acting as a line of defense against really digging in, finding deep details, and then being able to share across their interviews, what they learned from the candidate, and essentially sense check with each other and validate. I think another way you could do it too is if candidates do opt into, if you're using like interview recording notes or anything like that, which again allows you to be more present as a recruiter, as a hiring manager, or as an interviewer on a panel. But you are using those, you can also use those tools to sense check against the consistency from that individual throughout the process, because it is important. We're all trying to hire people to do impactful work in the business. We know hiring is a costly enterprise and hiring the wrong person can be costly. So again, I think using, multiple tools from technology to our own like expertise and really digging in deep into candidates' backgrounds helps us sort of weed that out.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. I talked a little bit about this in an earlier podcast, and it kind of goes hand in hand with our team calls it like AI proofing or AI defense your process, which is just we expect to know that all candidates are going to use it to
Hmm.
polish their resume, to prep for an interview, to even help practice like STAR method answers, and we're not only okay with that, we're like supportive. We encourage that as an AI forward company,
Yep.
but ways that we've sort of transitioned our interview process, if we've moved away from anything that's like take home type assignments or tests, it's everything's more like live scenario. And we've even kind of moved away from tell me a time when to a live on the spot, like tell me how you think through this type of a problem,
Yeah.
and really just trying to get at someone's critical thinking skills and then probing deeper of like, well, why do you think that? Or what if this happened? Or stuff that can feel more on the spot type assessing of someone's judgment essentially versus just what they've experienced and done in the past.
Yeah, 100%. We do require live working sessions for every role that's like for us sort of like a P4 level and above.
Mm.
It's just something again, I think like you said exactly, it gets you the ability to test them like on the spot and understand how they'll approach problem solving, what their judgment is like. And then also even like you can dig in, it sort of gives you alignment to your core values or leadership values as a company as well.
Yeah. So speaking of that, how do you recommend that you build a process that strikes a balance between catching the candidate fraud, the potential bad actors, and
Right.
also avoiding making every candidate feel like they're a suspect or causing too much friction in the process through our lines of defense that we have to have?
Yeah, so this is one of the tensions I think a lot about. Vast majority of people applying to roles are real, especially when you look at it from like the business side of it. They're legitimately looking for a job. Fraud detection turns into a vibe check where you're sort of like side eyeing all of these candidates, and you're going to introduce bias into the equation, and you're going to make a candidate experience feel more like an interrogation. Like that's not good. That's not how we want to approach things. We always want to approach things from a very candidate forward experience. But you have to look at it where you're not looking at the people themselves. You're more so looking at the patterns that you're seeing within the process and the patterns you're seeing within the application pool. So when you encounter one flag, I think it makes sense to sort of be a little curious about it. When you encounter a second flag, you got to pause and you got to dig a little bit deeper. And then, three flags, you may even want to bring a second set of eyes or additional technology tools in for review. So I don't think there's any single data point where you're going to allow that to tank, say a candidacy of someone. You need to layer in, like we said, that Swiss cheese approach. So different features, different tools. Um, and along with that, I would also say bring along not just those digital tools, but your analog tools that you bring as recruiters. So awareness of odd interview pauses, a pattern of like shutting off video or freezing video when they're answering a question just after you've asked one. And then again, like cross-referencing all the data points you have just to make sure that
Mhm.
this person, has true, good, extended online presence. What are good analogies I use with my teams? So we all as individuals are consistently getting, emails that seem sketchy with sketchy links. We've learned to be much more discerning in, how we go about examining those things, but not assuming that every email is malicious. So it's sort of, to me, it's the same principle. You have to be thoughtful, but not paranoid. And the faster we catch the bad actors, the less likely we are to correct for those and apply a heavy hand to like everyone. So, use scrutiny, but don't be too hard on it. Be discerning.
And I think that that's good news for candidates too, right? Because I think, at least with a lot of our processes, we offer opt out for things like interview recording or ID verification. And so candidates might worry, like, oh, will this negatively affect my candidacy? And the fact of the matter is, like you said, it's not one thing that catches candidate fraud. It's the patterns and the consistency across all these different checks that recruiting teams have implemented,
Right.
which is how you start to catch the bad actors. And candidly, our team actually has gotten not a lot of negative feedback from candidates. It's actually been really positive because I think candidates appreciate the fact that companies are going to a certain extent to make sure that the people that are real and want a job are getting surfaced and that the noise is getting cleared out because it actually benefits them and gives them more visibility.
Exactly. They're not fighting against fake candidates or fraudulent candidates who have like entire teams and networks behind them.
Yeah, absolutely. So you kind of mentioned some of this in a little bit, but like what are some of the signals that you have trained your people to take seriously?
Yeah. I mean, so tactically, we approach it from both digital forensics and what I would say is like observability, sort of the more analog approach. So, application and resume itself provides a digital footprint. So, any initial signals to fraud, you know, we're sort of beta testing some of that, but you touched on it like IP address, an email address or a LinkedIn profile that's newly created, different things like that. You can sort of get signals from of if people are using VPNs, even though that's one that a lot of people, that's not something that should be automatically disqualifying. A lot of people do use VPNs just for their own personal security, which is smart. So again, I think you need to like look at some of those different digital forensics and signals you can get. And then when it comes to more of that observability piece, really, like I said, we're seeing in trying to train our teams on video behavior. So, people's eyes moving off screen and in sort of odd patterns, whether they're reading answers or getting generated prompts delivered to them on a very timely basis. A lag in connection or processing delay, lip movements that don't exactly match up. Um, and then further, like observability signals too, like LinkedIn profile signals, maybe very few connections, no activity, no photo. One of the other things I think we've seen that's fairly unique, and it touches on your point of like upwards of 40 to 60% of potential engineering roles having candidate fraud, you're seeing huge early volume spikes from when you post a role. So it seems like whoever these groups are or individuals are, they like key in on a role when it's posted very quickly, probably knowing that they're going to be at the very top of the funnel. So they've probably built software and technology to get them in very early in high volume, which exhausts your recruiter's ability to maybe sort through, however many applications are in there and really have to focus on those ones at the top. So from our perspective, again, those both those sides. So the digital side and then like I said, the true like recruiter doing their observability checks as well.
Yeah, we've experienced a similar thing that we've noticed, which is that, like you said, the majority of fraud tends to come in within the first like few days of a role being posted.
Hmm.
And once you've let it kind of sit for a little while, then we tend to notice that it drips off a little bit. But yeah, I think all of those things are really good things to look out for. Something that our team is actually interested in that we're hoping to be able to test and implement soon is there's now technology that can like join the interview with you that can help detect some of that
Hmm.
candidate fraud or these like synthetic identities or even like cheating. So I think that's probably like an interesting next step for like the future of candidate fraud, like how we prevent it and catch it. I
Hmm.
guess what else do you think is in the future of this era of candidate fraud?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's a great question. It's a fascinating question, but it's also to me a frightening question, considering like the pace that we've seen to this point when it comes to, just how this is evolving on a daily basis. A few things that I'm currently watching. So I think again, the being able to verify people's identities is going to become a candidate asset, not just like an employer requirement. So I expect to see again, more of like profile based verification on the candidate side. So, them sort of owning that piece of it. That's something we're actually working on here. If you think about more of like a portable, verified sort of credential that travels with you as a candidate, that starts to again like if you have the ability to prove yourself and prove your credentials before somebody has the ability to sort of fake you and fake your credentials, it's a really good signal to, whether you're a freelancer, just sort of creating credibility with a new client, whether you're a caregiver, sort of verifying a profile before you ever meet somebody. It just changes the dynamic a little bit. Instead of being verification something that happens to candidates, it's much more like something that candidates own and carry with them, opens doors faster for them. So that's one area where I think like people taking a little bit of like that ownership of their own credentials since we're seeing so much fraud in that space. Second, I would say like you touched on deep fake detection. I think that's going to be essentially like built in and scaled into all of our platforms, whether it's your ATS like Greenhouse or potentially, video conferencing Zoom, within probably the next 12 to 18 months. So that's something that I think will probably be a built-in feature and built-in tool. You won't have to per se opt into it. And then third, I would say just from a volume perspective, you touched on the Gardner stat that 1 in 4 candidates, could be faked by 2028. Again, I think we're seeing that exceed that at a faster pace currently. So you can't, essentially you can't manually review your way out of that. You need to have that layered signal base, automated detection that, updates as their tactics are evolving. So static checklists are just not going to cut that. I guess one thing I'd leave recruiting leaders with, if you're still treating fraud prevention as a recruiting like operations problem, that just means that you're going to be a little bit too reactive in it. I think the companies that are going to handle it the best are treating it as a true like trust infrastructure problem. And that's something that you really have to build into the systems, just bolted on after the fact. And, another thing, final and closing, I guess, if you're encountering organized fraud at scale, report it. So we recently had a candidate we ran all the way through the process that we knew was fraudulent. We extended an offer to them. We invited them to show up on day one, but we'd contacted and been in touch with the FBI to make sure that, we were flagging this well ahead of time. We knew this was a fraudulent actor. We've confirmed it on multiple touch points from ID verification to the background check to our own like personal observability and everything. So just don't like sit back on that. When you see and engage with that kind of activity, flag it, surface it. The more people that do, the more there's going to be like, enforcement actions taken and more robust approach to preventing it in the future.
Wow. That's a great story and example, and thank you for leaving everyone with that note and some of that insight. Cory, this was such a great conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your stories from your years working as a TA leader and getting your perspective on this topic. And the Greenhouse Guide to Candidate Fraud is available on the Greenhouse site right now, or you can also find a link to it in the show description. And if you've encountered candidate fraud similar to what we talked about today, you can report it to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center at www.ic3.gov. Thanks for watching or listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, Shannon.